Welcome, everyone. We're excited to present Navigating SQL Server upgrades today. We're just about to get started, but wanted to give an extra minute for anybody trying to pop over from maybe another virtual meeting. So we'll get rolling here in just about a minute. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Andrea Kircher, and I'm the Director of People and Strategy at Fortified Data. And we're really excited to bring you this webinar this afternoon around navigating SQL Server upgrades. As many of you know, the versions tend to come and go. New features are released, and sometimes there's some opportunities to be gained by migrating or upgrading to a newer version. And excited to introduce to you our specialist today. He's been a member of Fortified Data for quite some time now. Mr. Frank Gill is a senior consultant on our consulting team. He has over 22 years of IT experience, 14 specializing in SQL Server. He has developed a lot of large-scale, high availability SQL Server environments for Fortune 100 companies. His expertise is in performance troubleshooting and architecture design, and he's skilled in implementing new technology solutions for clients. Outside of that, he's also often our trivia champion. So if you have any random trivia questions, I guarantee you Frank can answer those as well. But as Frank jumps into the topic today, if you have a question, please drop it into either the chat or the Q&A. And I'll be monitoring that as we move along, and we'll get those answered for you as we progress through today's presentation. We will be recording this, and we'll post it. Actually, we'll send it out to you following this. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mr. Frank Gill.
Great. Thank you, Andrea. Yeah, so as Andrea said, we're going to talk about SQL Server 2014 and end of life and why you want to upgrade from 2014 if you're still running there. And then I'll talk through the versions that have come since then. So since 2014, there have been 4 versions of SQL Server, actually 5, 2016, 2017, 2019, and 2022. So that is 4. I'm good at counting. So we'll talk through those reasons. We'll talk through preparing for the upgrade, and then I'll talk about ways that you can maintain business continuity both during and after the upgrade. There are a lot of moving parts during a database upgrade. You will most probably, if you're going from 2014 to a new version, you'll most probably be migrating to new hardware, because that's one of the benefits of that migration. Is if you're running 2014, chances are you are running on hardware that is fairly old, and it gives you an opportunity to do that hardware refresh. And there's also the opportunity to move workloads to the cloud if that is something that you're looking to do. But as I said, there are a lot of moving parts there. You not only have databases, you have application code, you have SQL Server jobs, logins, all kinds of pieces, and sort of talk through different ways to make that experience as smooth as possible. So to get into the reasons to upgrade, in my mind, one of the biggest ones is on the left, which is security, but the major groupings are security, improved performance, new features. You can do a lot of things in the versions that I talked about after 2014 that you couldn't do in 2014, and then compliance. So talking about security, and as I said, I think this is one of the, it is sort of the mission critical reason to upgrade. So extended support for SQL Server 2014 ended on July 9th of this year. And what that means is that Microsoft no longer provides security patches for SQL Server 2014. And that gives cyber attackers sort of a playing field for getting into your systems. You know, these people are constantly looking for vulnerabilities in software. SQL Server, in that, there are a lot of different attack vectors, but SQL Server um, is a big one. And without those security upgrades, vulnerabilities can be discovered and they can be exploited. Um, as I said, older software is a target, and ransomware attacks target vulnerability 14 specifically. And you can, the cost of a ransomware attack can be just devastating. Basically, what the ransomware attack does is they get into your system, and if you have other security vulnerabilities within your system, say, you have XP command shell enabled, you have weak passwords, it gives the cyber attackers that into your system, and they can, you know, upload malware, they can encrypt drives, and they can basically hold a business hostage. In 2021, ransomware attacks cost $20 billion for companies that were affected. And the prediction is that cost will grow to $265 billion by 2031. So that is now 7 years away. And you can kind of expect that number to rise, linearly over time. So by upgrading to 2022, for example, but basically any version past 2014 at this point, you will sort of close those holes. You will receive regular security updates from Microsoft that will reduce that attack surface for cyber attackers. And I can tell we've had clients that have been through cyber attacks over the past year, and it has been really challenging, both for us to help them get back on their feet and then for the companies to get back on their feet. So, as I said, I believe this is really the number one reason to move off of 2014. So, Andrea, any questions before I go on?
No questions yet.
Okay. So the second reason, and actually combine two of them, improved performance and new features. So I said 4 versions of SQL Server have released since 2014. Each of those versions contain new features, both improvements to existing technology and existing features. But there are a lot of new features that are available that let you do things that you couldn't do prior to 2014. And a lot of this has to do with Azure. So I'm not trying to sell Azure, but Microsoft is. So as I said, a lot of the features that I'm going to talk about involve Azure, and actually a number of the migration methods that I'm going to talk about involve Azure. It is still a valid use case to run SQL Server on-prem or in a hosted data provider physical data provider or hosting provider. But there are a lot of features that are available in Azure. So if anybody has any questions about those, I can speak to those. So just to kind of talk through by version. With 2016, they introduced Query Store, and Query Store is a feature that allows you to determine when a specific query plan has a regression in performance. And what that means is that SQL Server, when it runs a query, it generates an execution plan. And so it says, what's the most efficient way to get the data that you have asked me to get, or update the data that you've asked me to get, to do what you've asked me to do. And those plans, those execution plans, are determined by statistics, which is it tracks the distribution of your data, and the distribution of data can change. And so a plan that was good, a week ago or a month ago may no longer be the optimal plan because of changes in the data. Query Store tracks those changes, and you can actually look and see what has improved in your, or what has, sorry, what has changed and where things have regressed. And you can figure out ways to, either update statistics or you can actually force plans. There's a lot that you can do to enhance performance. Um, Column store indexes have been enhanced. So column store indexes are generally used for a warehousing environment. If you think about a traditional B tree index, you are sorting data by pages, and it allows you to kind of do a targeted read to a specific row. Column store indexes sort data and index data by column, and changes have been made to really increase the performance of column store indexes and allow you to get a bigger bang for your buck by using them. And there's also been improvements to batch mode processing. So that kind of goes hand in hand with the business intelligence data warehousing. The way that batches are processed has changed so that they will process more efficiently. So jumping to 2017, adaptive query processing. This is a big thing, and it's sort of, we'll see it as we move through. There are kind of enhancements to this in both 2019 and 2022. But basically what Microsoft set out to do was, I talked about that idea of plans being generated to run a query. Adaptive query processing gives the optimizer, the part of the SQL Server engine that generates those plans, the ability to adapt to changes in both, the input, what you are asking for, and also changes in the data. And so to an extent, you can think about it as automatic, and actually the next bullet point relates to it, this idea of automatic database tuning. So if you've been a DBA as long as I have, a lot of times what I do or what I've done is, have a piece of code and an application will come to me and say, hey, this code is running slow. And, there's a challenge in defining what does slow mean, but you take a look and you look at that code and you figure out how to tune that code to make it run more efficiently. With adaptive query processing and automatic database tuning, the SQL Server engine actually has the ability to do that tuning on the fly. So it really makes the life of the DBA, the life of the application developer, kind of the life of everyone who uses the database easier because it just sort of fixes itself. And you've got resumable online index rebuilds. So with prior to 2017, if I wanted to run an online rebuild of an index, I had to run it all the way through. It was all or nothing. And there are some very large indexes out there. And an online index rebuild is a huge benefit because you don't have to lock people out of the index while that rebuild is happening. So with 2017, you have the ability to stop that and then start it over again. So you can have an index rebuild job and you can set a duration on it. Let's say you have a maintenance window that it runs for 3 hours. You can run that rebuild for 3 hours. It will stop, and then you pick it up the next time that job runs. It knows where to start it again. So that is a huge benefit. 2019, they renamed between 2017 and 2019. The marketing team renamed adaptive query processing to intelligent query processing. So there are some other features that have been put in place that allow SQL Server to make those decisions and optimize, have the optimizer work better at what it does. If you're interested, I can give you kind of details about what happened when. There's some really nice charts out there that talk through what changes were made in which version. The next one is this accelerated database recovery. And this is one that is close to my heart because I love the transaction log. That's where I like to geek out. And what accelerated database recovery does is when you restart an instance of SQL Server, or if you're running availability groups and you fail over to a secondary node, SQL Server has to go through it does an analysis of the transaction log, and it looks for two different things. It looks for transactions that were in flight at the time of that restart or failover, and for transactions that were that committed and were written to the transaction log, but weren't hardened to disk. And once it completes that analysis, it has to undo those transactions that were in flight because based on the idea of atomicity within the database, you can't have half a transaction run. So it has to roll back those changes and undo those changes. And then it has to write those committed transactions to the transaction log. And that operation is done to maintain consistency within the database. And if you have a long running transaction that has either committed or you have tried to update a billion rows and you got half a billion rows through, it has to roll those half a billion in, let's say, half a billion deletes back. What accelerated database recovery does is it tracks the changes. You as you're changing the transaction logs, it writes the previous version to a store in tempdb. And so I have seen examples where without accelerated database recovery on an AG failover, it can take a minute or 2 minutes for the application to come up and online. With accelerated database recovery on, that failover happens in sub-second. So if you are a highly transactional system and you are using availability groups, this is a feature that can really improve your performance and improve the availability of your application. And then data virtualization. What this is you you now have the ability to connect SQL Server to other data sources. So when I started working with databases, everything was RDBMS. You had SQL Server, you had Oracle, DB2. Generally, everything was running on-prem. You were doing everything with a SQL database. Now you have NoSQL databases. You have databases in the cloud. Microsoft has Cosmos DB. There are all of these different options. And data virtualization gives you the ability to use SQL Server and use it as you are used to, but you can connect it to these various data sources and pull data from those sources. But your experience, you're sitting at Management Studio or you're sitting in front of Azure Data Studio and writing queries, and your experience is the same. And so that's a really valuable thing in terms of making that data available without having to necessarily learn a new database technology. So that is virtualization. Synapse Link gets sort of to that same idea. So Azure Synapse is kind of the umbrella term for Microsoft's business intelligence processing. And this gives you the ability to do a link between an instance of SQL Server on-prem or in Azure to that Synapse environment and have that same sort of experience. Query Store enhancements. There have been changes to Query Store in 2022. One of the big ones is prior to 2022, when the optimizer generated that good plan, it was a one-to-one thing. You had one plan to a query. With the Query Store enhancements, SQL Server can now actually store multiple plans for the same query based on the values that are being looked for. So it's another step in that idea of we're going to make SQL Server perform better, and you don't have to do anything. You don't have to worry about trying to tune these things. So we will just make the code run better. Um, Parameter sensitive plan optimization. This is kind of a similar thing that I just talked about. And it is part of that intelligent query processing, where if you have a query with a parameter, it will optimize a plan for a specific parameter value and store those multiple plans. Um, and then finally, you've got contained availability groups. And if you've worked with availability groups, they are, in my mind, they're a really great solution for both high availability and disaster recovery. But one of the challenges has been that availability groups contain user databases. When you are running SQL Server, you are storing things in the system databases. So master, you are storing logins, and MSDB, you are storing jobs, just as two examples. And so when you're running an availability group, it is your responsibility prior to 2022 to coordinate and synchronize those objects between those system level objects between your replicas. And it is something you can do. It takes some work, and you need to make sure that you're maintaining the processes that do that sync, because if you fail over, if I'm running on node A, I create a login on node A and I forget to create it on node B. When I fail over to node B, that login will not exist, and an application or a user trying to connect with that login won't be able to get in. Contained availability groups basically create an AG level version of those system databases. So you have all of your logins and your jobs contained within the database. When you fail over, you're good to go. You know that those objects will be there, and you don't have to worry about, uh, you know, synchronizing things, because SQL Server does it for you. So that is, in my mind, a big win, because, as I said, it is possible to do that sync. I've got processes I've written to do it. There are a lot of people who have kind of put processes together to do it, but it is fairly involved, and there are a lot of decisions you have to make, and this just takes those decisions off the table.
Frank, we do have a question from the
Yes.
audience. So this is actually a multi-part question.
Okay.
First, it starts off with which has more security, column level protection or row level security?
I guess it depends what you want to protect. I mean, they're protecting access to the data. So it says, you're determining who can access the data, and you can set that at both the column level and the row level. So for example, if you want to limit for row level security, if you have a table that's storing employee information, you can set row level security to say that a certain user can only access a certain number of values of a column. So if you have like an employee type, they can only see. Uh, so with that example of the employee table, let's say I'm a manager. I can set row level security to say that I can only view the rows that have my manager ID attached to them. Column level security, you're saying I have a table that contains employee information. One of the places of information in that table is a social security number, and I can exclude rights to see that social security number. So that's kind of the difference there.
And just to continue on with that question, what is the most efficient way to achieve, and this is another two-parter, column level protection with either always encrypted or dynamic data masking, and or row level security with either always encrypted or dynamic data masking?
So can you read the question again?
Yeah, what's the most efficient way to achieve And then they said either
Okay,
call,
right.
yeah.
Um, I'd have to think about that just in terms of efficiency. The one thing I would say is that dynamic data masking, it is a masking technology. So what it's designed to do is when a user selects data and it returns the data, that data will be masked. So in the example of a social security number, you can set up a mask so that you see either pound signs, or you can set up a mask so you'd only see the first three characters. Not something I'd recommend with a social security number, um, but the data values are not encrypted in any way. So you can brute force those things. You can just generate a list of all possible social security numbers and just look for a hit. But in terms of the most efficient way, it's a little bit outside the scope of this, and I'd need to do some thinking. If you want, is my email address in here, Andrea?
If not, we'll make sure it gets sent out
Yeah.
afterwards.
So feel free to hit me up with an email, and I can provide a more detailed answer. Sorry, I can't do it off the top of my head.
Oh, and then we just had one other question pop in
Mhm.
as well. If I grant only access to stored proc or view, do I have to grant access to the underlying objects as well?
No. If you're granting access if you're allowing them to run the store procedure, then that it allows them to run the store procedure. So, no.
All right. Okay,
All
thank
right.
you. That's all for now.
All right. So the last reason to upgrade is compliance. 2014, things like GDPR, and I mean, HIPAA was around, but GDPR is fairly new. And if you're not familiar, GDPR it's legislation in Europe that says that you have to, as a company, if I, as your customer, say, get rid of my personal data, um, you have to be able to get rid of personal data. And SQL Server 2014 has not been registered as compliant with that regulation. HIPAA is health information, so you need to be able to protect health information. And because of the potential security loopholes or security vulnerabilities in 2014, um, it is not HIPAA compliant. There are also audit and reporting requirements. There are some things that, you know, features that will allow you to audit and report, but once again, auditing organizations uh, may not validate or certify 2014 for the reasons that we talked about. And those things, both the data protection regulations and audit and reporting requirements, can lead to financial penalties. There's some serious, I don't have examples, but I know that there have been some serious bills written to businesses running in Europe for violation of GDPR. So just another reason to uh, do that upgrade. All right. Gets us to the idea of preparing for an upgrade. Um, and this is where I talked about, you will see Azure in here a number of times. Um, but when you prepare for an upgrade, um, you want to identify the instances that are going to be migrated or upgraded. And one of the things that I always like to remind people is that you're running code on 24. So you may have an opportunity to sunset instances. You could have an application that could be replaced, and it's an opportunity to look for those cases and potentially improve uh, your environment, improve your process. So you want to identify those candidate instances, both for migration, and then also look for opportunities to consolidate instances. 2014, once again, running on older hardware. If you're standing up new hardware, processors are faster, memory is faster, disk is faster. So you may have the opportunity to reduce your hardware footprint, but still run at an acceptable level of speed. And so those are two things to take into consideration when you are doing that identification of instances. You then want to assess the environment. And there are two different tools that I'll talk about in terms of environment assessment. And then you want to leverage compatibility. So one of the big challenges in the past to upgrading to a newer version of SQL Server is you're running vendor code and the vendor has not certified the new version, going to guarantee that their code will run on 2022. So what Microsoft has done is, there's a setting in on the database level called compatibility level. And if you set that, you can set that to a previous version. You can now set it back to 2016, but it will run SQL Server as if you were running on that version. It will basically limit your feature set, but it is there to allow you to say, okay, yes, I am running on SQL Server 2022, but because you only certified 2016, 2017, 2019, as a vendor, I will run at the compatibility level of the version that you've certified. And it allows you to meet those certification requirements. Talking about assessing the environment, the two tools that I'll talk about are the Data Migration Assistant. And what this tool does, it's a tool available for free download from Microsoft. There's also a plugin for Azure Data Studio for the Migration Assistant. And what you do is you point this at the instances you have identified and you give it the destination, your target version for your upgrade. So 2016, 2017, 2019, 2022, and it will analyze that instance and it will find deprecated features. So it will tell you these are features that Microsoft has deprecated, which basically means that there's not a guarantee that it will be available in a future version. It will identify breaking changes. So things that if you migrate to your target, your application will break. And then behavior changes. It worked one way in 2014. It works a different way in 2022, and you need to be aware of that. It's not necessarily going to break your application, but it could change the way the application behaves, and it could change the way that the application performs. So the Data Migration Assistant will generate a report, and it will show you those things. And then based on that, you can remediate or potentially, change the way that your application is running or your database is running. Azure Migrate is a tool, and it is an end-to-end migration tool. So it basically will run a discovery for your SQL Server instances, and then it leverages the Data Migration Assistant to assess those instances. And then you do have the ability to migrate instances with the Azure Migrate tool to Azure, either SQL Server running on a VM in Azure, SQL Server managed instance, or Azure SQL database. The one thing I'll note here is that in terms of that target, when I'm kind of talking through this idea of an upgrade, I am thinking about it in terms of a traditional instance of SQL Server. So you have an instance of SQL Server that's running multiple databases that is supporting an application or applications. In general, Azure SQL database, the single database offering, is not a target for those sort of traditional relational database systems, because there are so many differences in the way it runs. It's sort of a different animal than that normal instance. And if you run the DMA, the Data Migration Assistant, for an instance with a target of Azure SQL database, that's where you're going to see a lot of these breaking changes come out, because There are things like with Azure SQL Database, you cannot have linked servers. You also cannot have cross-database queries. So if you've ever written a query with a three-part name, database name, schema name, table name, that won't work in Azure SQL Database. So that's the kind of thing that'll get flagged there.
Frank, we do have a question.
Yep.
Are there compliance or security concerns with running compatibility level 2014 or earlier at the database level on a 2016 plus version updates?
I don't believe so, because you're running the bits and you're getting security updates. All the compatibility level does is says, run with the feature set that was available in that version. So the actual, bits of SQL Server are the version that you're running on. So if you're running on 22 and you set it to 2014, if that is possible, I can't remember how far back those compatibility levels go now with the sunset, but you are running the bits of the new version. It's just, like I said, limiting that feature set.
Great, thank you.
All right. So we talked about, why to migrate or why to upgrade. We've talked about how to prepare for that upgrade. So now we'll talk about methods to actually do the upgrade or migration. And I'm using those terms sort of interchangeably, as I said before, because you're upgrading from a version that's 10 years old. In most cases, migrating to new hardware is the best way to go here. You can do an in-place upgrade from 2014 to a newer version, but I'll talk about pros and cons in a minute. So here we go. So in-place upgrade or a migration to a new instance. The in-place upgrade, the pros here are that it is simpler. You don't have to have new hardware. You don't have to worry about moving the databases from one environment to another. And it's available for 2012 and newer. And it minimizes the application downtime. The upgrade, in my experience, takes 15 to 30 minutes for an instance of SQL Server. Your mileage may vary there, but it is generally quicker, especially if you're dealing with large databases. The cons are that rollback is really challenging. It is difficult to roll back that upgrade if you've done it in place. If you do the in-place upgrade, you also don't have an opportunity to test. You are taking one environment, you are upgrading it. And so applications are running against the old environment. You do your upgrade, applications are then hitting the same environment with the new version of SQL Server. And I can tell you that, you can be as diligent as you think is possible in assessing your environment and figuring out, possible behavior changes or breaking changes with the new version with your applications. Stuff gets missed, and it can be really painful to try to remediate those things post upgrade. And then also, hardware requirements have changed from 2014 going forward. So you need to make sure that the hardware you're running on, which is potentially 10 years old, has the horsepower and has the minimum requirements that are required by the version that you're upgrading to. Any questions, Andrea?
No new questions.
All right. So the other option is to migrate to a new instance. Pros here, this allows for testing of the new version. You can stand that new environment up. You can migrate your databases over to it. You can run from a test environment against that with your application, and you can work out those bugs on the front end. Reverting to the previous version is simple. You just point back to the old environment, and then, figure out what went wrong when you cut over, and then potentially, do that cut over again. And it does provide the opportunity to move to more modern hardware. As I said, 10 years is a long time in terms of computer chips and memory. There's a lot of, there are a lot of things available that weren't available in terms of speed and just, chip design that weren't available 10 years ago. Cons are that you need to stand up that new environment. You need to have the hardware available. You need to have, that environment built out, and that takes time, depending on the environment you're working in. I know that, having in large corporations, it could be a real challenge to get new hardware configured. And then there's a cost associated with that new hardware. And you want to do an analysis and figure out where the cost benefit there is. And this is where, once again, Azure comes into the cloud, I should say, comes into the picture here. Because one of the other things that this gives you is the ability to potentially move a workload to the cloud. And that gives you the benefit of not having to worry about paying for power, not having to worry about paying for cooling. All of that is included in your Azure price tag, and it can simplify the administration of that environment. And then the other con is potentially a longer application downtime. There are ways to reduce this, but you do need to move the data from the source system to the destination system, and that does take time. And you need to figure out what kind of an outage window is acceptable, and then figure out how to meet that restriction, meet that window. Right. So talk about migration methods. The three I'll talk about are backup, restore, log shipping, and then one that I work with availability groups quite a bit, but it's just not a method that I had thought about previously, and that is to use availability groups to migrate. And I'll talk about the advantages and disadvantages there. So backup and restore, your pros are that it's simple and reliable. It's been around forever. You can run a backup with native SQL. There are tools that you can use to run the backup restore. You can automate this process. You have opportunities within T-SQL to use agent jobs to automate the process. There are also tools in PowerShell, both native SQL Server PowerShell commands, and then my favorite is DBA tools. If you are not familiar with DBA tools and you are interested in doing anything with PowerShell and SQL Server, look at DBA tools. DBAtools.io is their website. And we actually was just talking to a colleague about it, and I said that anytime that I think I want to do this with PowerShell with SQL Server, I go and look at DBA tools, because I've had half a dozen instances where I've spent the better part of a day writing a script, and then I go to look at DBA tools and figure out, hey, they did what I wanted to do better, and it's available for free. So that's a tool that you can use to do the backup restore. One of the nice things about DBA tools, and you can actually do this with other processes, is if you have backups of your existing system, you can leverage those existing backups and use those to restore. And what that can do is, if you think about a backup restore process, I have, my source environment, I need to run the backup from there, and I need to restore that to the test environment. Well, those environments may not be in the same physical location. So there may be a copy process in there where you have to take those backup files and move them to the new environment. If you can leverage existing backups, you take the backup and copy steps out of the equation, and it will really speed that process up. Backup restores also allow for point-in-time recovery. So you could potentially, say, I want to restore the new environment to a specific point in time, and anything that happens after that, I don't want to move over. That is an option. And then also this works with standard edition, regardless of standard or enterprise. The big con is that it can be time consuming to move large databases over. There are ways to get past that. You can run full backups, differential backups, and log backups to get yourself over more quickly. But that process is time consuming, and you need to make sure that you've got it dialed in to restore what you want to restore, and make sure once again that you're going to meet whatever kind of window you have for your migration. Um, Log shipping, this is sort of a subset of backup restore because you are backing up the database and restoring it to the destination system. Um, the nice thing about this is that it requires minimal downtime and it works with standard edition. What log shipping does is you basically pull a full backup from your source, restore it to the destination, and then you set up a series of jobs that does transaction log backups, copies them to the new system, and then restores them on a cadence. So the potential cons here are that you're configuring this per database. So you have to set up log shipping for each database. You have to run backup restore for each database, but part of that automation process can be to run all of those backups as part of a single script. Here you've got to configure log shipping at the database level, and then you need to make sure that log shipping is doing what it's supposed to do. So you have to monitor it, and there are moving parts here, and you can potentially lose network connectivity between your source and your destination. One of the pros is that log shipping is kind of bulletproof. So if you do lose network connectivity, once that connectivity is restored, the log shipping process knows what transaction logs have shipped to the destination, and it will pick up and get you back in sync. But you just need to make sure that you know what's going on and that your destination source or destination system database is in the proper state for your upgrade migration. And then the last one I'll talk about is availability groups. And so you can now mix versions of SQL Server within an availability group. So you do have and I would say that this is an option that is best suited in an environment where you're currently using availability groups. So if I have an availability group with 2 replicas running 2014, I can stand up my new version of 2022, add that to the availability group, and then just fail over. So pros here is it provides high availability and it requires minimal downtime. It's basically the time of that failover. The cons are that if you're not running availability groups, it requires a setup of a Windows Server failover cluster, and that is can be challenging, if you're not a Windows admin. And then it does require Enterprise Edition, but it is a method. Like I said, ideally, if you're running availability groups, it can really streamline that process. There's a lot of setup that goes into it, a lot of things that you have to make sure are working correctly. But if you failed an availability group over, it is a pretty quick process. And the other benefit here, it sort of gives you the advantages of that migration to another system. If things go south, you can just point back to the 2014 instance and you're good to go. All right. So, anybody have any other questions?
I don't see any as of yet.
Yeah, one thing that I would just mention is that, I work for Fortified. We do migrations. It's one of the things that we do. And, I think we do it really well, both on-prem, moving from a physical server to another physical server and a hosting provider, moving from a data center to a hosting provider, and then also moving from systems on-prem to Azure. And I talked a little bit about the various destination options you have in Azure. You can move to SQL Server running on a VM, and that looks and feels just like any install of SQL Server that you work with. It is effectively using Azure as your hosting provider. There is SQL Server Managed Instance, which is sort of a hybrid of your traditional instance and a managed system. Second.
We do have a quick question, Frank.
Sure.
In general, would you recommend migrating from SQL Server to Azure SQL Server?
It depends. I mean, if you're talking about Azure SQL Database, so that's where terminology gets really tricky. Um, it depends. I mean, there's still people who are reticent to move to the cloud because it's not my environment. If you have that, uh, that mindset, on-prem is still valid. The thing that you need to keep in mind is that if you are running your own data center, as I said, you are paying for that hardware, you are paying for cooling, you're paying for power, you're paying for the network. If you have a hosting provider on-prem, you're paying them for those things. If you move to Azure, once again, those things are kind of rolled into the cost of the environment. The one thing that I would say is that, as I said, Microsoft is pushing people to Azure. That is what they see as the future. That's not a reason to migrate to Azure. But in my mind, if it makes sense for you, and that comes down to cost, it comes down to the ability to run that, to have resources that are comfortable working in Azure, I would say I don't see a blocker there. Um, Microsoft has changed I like to think of it as them having turned the aircraft carrier around. If you go back to 2005, which is the version that I started working with, you got service packs released like every 6 months to a year. They don't do service packs anymore. They do cumulative updates, and those come out it's pretty much a monthly cadence now. And one of the reasons for that is Azure. Um, Azure is Microsoft's testing platform. That's not to say when you go to Azure, they are using your systems to test, but they have this huge environment in which they can test things and look for bugs. I remember talking to somebody from Microsoft, and they said when 2008 released, they had a 3-year period baked in to find bugs. So, the customer was the tester. Now Azure is the tester. And so it is a really robust environment. And also, just to make clear, when you move to managed instance, and this is true for 2022, if you move to managed instance with SQL Server 2022, the bits that are running for that managed instance are the same bits that are running for an on-prem instance. So if I do an install of SQL Server 2022, it's basically fully compatible, which is not true for previous versions. So that's a very long way of saying it does depend, but I don't see a reason not to move to Azure if it makes sense for you.
Thank you, Frank. We actually have a couple more questions coming in as well.
Okay.
So one of them reads, steps to migrate 5 AG replicas, 1 primary and 4 secondary.
I mean, it's basically migrating. I mean, assuming that you're going to maintain that environment on the destination side, you would build a 5-node cluster out on your destination, migrate to your primary, and then set up these secondaries either by automatic seeding or pushing the data out to your secondaries and syncing them up. There's really no magic in it. It's basically you do have your secondaries in place, but you're migrating from a primary to a primary and then configuring the availability group from there. There are ways to kind of automate that process, and there are things that you can do to simplify it, but at its heart, that's what you'd be doing.
Okay. And then one other question has popped in, and it says, any thoughts or concerns about Azure Arc in general, or specifically for licensing and extended security updates for on-prem SQL installation?
That is out of my wheelhouse. We have some resources that could talk more intelligently about Arc. But if you have questions, you can send them to me and I can either point you at the right resource or get you an answer.
I'm going to drop Frank's email address in the chat for easy access. All right. Any other questions out there? We've emptied the chat and the QA. So I think, one, we just want to say thank you so much for stopping by for today's webinar. We're excited to bring these to everybody, and we're looking to have another one in October. So keep your eyes on our social media, and you'll also be on our mailing list from this one as well. We would like to offer a limited time offer, good through September 30th. So if you're looking at an upgrade and you're thinking, gosh, I could really use some external expertise on this, give us a call. If you commit to an upgrade by September 30th, you will also receive a free assessment for up to 5 instances. So Frank can maybe give a little high level of what that assessment would look like, but it's a unique opportunity.
Yeah, so the assessment, basically, we look at your environment. We have a proprietary tool called Wisdom, which is the tool that our managed services team uses to monitor client systems. But we run that against your environment for a period of time, generally 2 to 4 weeks. It pulls back data. It allows us to kind of assess your environment for best practices, both at the Windows level and the SQL Server level. It gets in depth in terms of indexing strategy, just missing indexes, duplicate indexes, just kind of best practices as a whole. And we provide you with a report, kind of sets those things out in terms of both priority and impact. And it is just a way to make sure that your environment is running optimally. It can be a great addition to that data migration assistant, just to run that assessment pre-migration, and you can figure out what things you can fix on the front end. And then when you get to your new system, things are running well.
Perfect. Well, thank you again. It doesn't look like we have any additional questions. So upon the completion of, or the conclusion of this, you will receive the video recording of the webinar, and we hope to see you at a future engagement.
Yep. And shoot me an email if you have questions, because I like to talk about this stuff and my wife doesn't. So any opportunity is welcome.
Yes. And if Frank doesn't know, I guarantee you we have a team member that has seen that before. So
Yep.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, Frank. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good day.
All right. Bye-bye.